because this is one specific case to one specific area within England, which is in Rotherham, okay? And the people that were prosecuted or have been prosecuted or are still being investigated in that specific case or in the Rotherham, which is, mind you know as well as I do, highly populated. A majority of the people there are Asian or Southeastern Asian anyway. It's not the same as Essex or London or Cornwall. So obviously, then when you're mentioning national statistics, I think you're comparing apples and pears. Because you said nationally there are 3% Muslims.
Okay, Daniel,
right?
let me respond to what you said. I got your point. Let me respond to it because I think there's an issue here, understandably so, of shock and denial. And I just need you to be aware of something that you may not be aware of. Because I started this conversation all those years ago in a similar level of shock and denial. Unfortunately for your argument, it's not just Rotherham. Yes, in Rotherham, this has been, it's the most famous one, or infamous one, because it was the first one to be exposed. In 2014, an inquiry found in Rotherham there were more than 1,400 victims, 1,400 victims of grooming and sexual exploitation between 1997 and 2013. That's just in one town. But it gets worse, Daniel. Then it happened in Rochdale. And then in Rochdale, they found that basically sentences were given up to 19 years because of crimes committed against girls between the age of 13 and 15 in and around Rochdale between 2008 and 2010. Then there was a case in Oxford in 2013 where 5 Muslim men were convicted and handed sentences at the Old Bailey for exploiting girls between 11 and 15. All of the men were of Pakistani origin, except for 2 who were North African, also Muslim. Then it was in Bristol, where 13 Somali Muslim men were jailed for more than a total of 100 years after they were convicted in 2014 of running an inner-city sex ring. Then in Aylesbury, 6 South Asian men were jailed in 2015. For grooming underage white girls between 2006 and 2012. Then, in Peterborough, a total of 10 men were convicted of child sex crimes in the town. And the boss, Muhammad Khobaib, who was originally from Pakistan, he was jailed for 13 years at the Old Bailey after he was found guilty of forcing a 14-year-old girl to perform a sex act on him. And then Newcastle, and Daniel, you know what? It's too depressing to carry on. It goes on and on. One second, Daniel. The pattern in all of these, overwhelmingly, is South Asian Muslim men, primarily Pakistani, sometimes Somali Muslims, sometimes North African Muslims. It doesn't help us, Daniel, to pretend this wasn't a phenomenon that was replicated across the country. What I would advise you said you're a South Asian Muslim man, therefore your name probably is Daniel or something other than Daniel. I would advise you to address this topic head on and not pretend it's not a national phenomenon, because I guarantee you that anger will rise if you come on radio and pretend this is not a national problem. The murder of Stephen Lawrence was a moment, a turning point in this country that led to the Macpherson inquiry, instituted initially by the Labour government, and then the Macpherson report, which coined the phrase institutional racism and shifted the debate in this country around race permanently and forever. And I'm going to say to you right now that that was the murder of one man. His mother now sits in the House of Lords. This scandal involving 27 cities with probably thousands of underage young girls, it must lead to a Stephen Lawrence-style national inquiry looking into what the institutional failures have been. She was impregnated twice before the age of 15 in her care home because an adult predator was allowed into their care home to statutorily rape her. Eventually found dead from a heroin overdose. There has been failures on an institutional level in the care homes up and down this country. There have been failures on an institutional level in the police up and down this country. And there have been failures on an institutional level in local Labour councils, probably not only Labour, but mainly Labour councils up and down this country, because people have been scared of being called racist. And the fear of racism, or the fear of so-called Islamophobia, which is a misnomer, the fear, more appropriately, of anti-Muslim bigotry, must never be an excuse to allow underage girls to be raped and abused in this way. But it was. Think of that. Imagine that. 27 cities and counting Because I can guarantee you we haven't heard the end of this yet. Imagine the thousands of victims. Imagine the impunity with which these men must have been acting. Some of the girls as young as 11. One girl, if my memory serves me correctly, it was in Oxford. One girl was even branded by her raper as property of, and then his name on her leg. And I think, if memory serves me correctly, that girl was 11 years old. It is an absolute disgrace that this has been allowed to go on in this country. And you may hear me being angry right now. If you're not going to be angry about this, what on earth are you going to get angry about? People have cared for their reputations over the safety of children in this country being raped and drugged and passed around like meat, because of the bigotry and the prejudices of these Pakistani Muslim men who were looking down on these children as less than, as inferior, as some form of infidel that doesn't deserve honor or dignity. And I say that because if you want to, and I address you now here, oh woke left wing, you talk about believing the victim. Look it up. Go to your smartphone and Google Ella Hill. She writes a piece in The Independent in which, and she's a survivor of this form of grooming gang child sexual exploitation. And she writes a column in which she describes the religious extremist terminology her abusers were using as they were sexually exploiting her as a child. In which she talks of how they called her an infidel and how they abused her race and her lack of Islamic faith, and justified treating her in this way because they viewed her as less than, because they believed themselves to be Muslim supremacists. Don't tell me that their Muslim identity had nothing to do with this. I have lived and breathed this community all of my life. I can guarantee you that it's not the cause, but a factor in the way in which these girls was treated was the culture of these men, and as part of that culture is their religious attitude towards non-Muslims. And that is the reason that you see almost exclusively that they are men like me, Pakistani, British, Muslim. Most of them. Some of them Bangladeshi Muslims, some of them Indian Muslims, some of them North African Muslims, some of them Somali Muslims. All of them Muslims, almost all Pakistani Muslims. And the victims, almost all underaged white girls. Now, who will lead, who will defend the voiceless in this national scandal? Who will lead the case for saying we need a national inquiry into how this would have been tolerated for so long in any other crime? And even, yes, the murder of that one man, Stephen Lawrence, which set off, and rightfully so, a huge national debate around institutional racism in this country. In any other case, you first get through the phase of being able to talk about it. Then you get to justice, where you convict the perpetrators. Then you start looking at those who covered up for the perpetrators. And that's what the Macpherson inquiry did in the case of Stephen Lawrence. And it deemed the police institutionally racist. Well, I ask you now, we've started to convict people. Yes, I listed those 27 cities for you, which is bad enough as it is. But where's the accountability for the police who covered this up? Where's the accountability for the Labour councils who covered this up? Where's the compensation for the victims? Because the police deliberately shelved investigations into their statutory rape because they wanted to be politically correct.